Welcome to Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we'll walk you through the Epicurean texts and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We're now in the middle of a series of podcasts intended to provide a general overview of Epicurean philosophy based on the organizational structure employed by Norman DeWitt in his book, Epicurus and His Philosophy. Now let's join the discussion. Welcome to episode 169. This week we are continuing in our discussion of chapter 10 of DeWitt's book. This is entitled The New Freedom. And we are currently in the middle of a subsection entitled Freedom and Necessity, and we're about to go to a subsection entitled Necessity and Fortune. Before we go into today's discussion, let me say this, that certainly over the last week, as we've discussed on the forum and looked further into all of the different arguments involving determinism, it is such a deep and complicated subject that virtually nobody agrees with anybody else on, that we can't really hope to cover in this podcast everything that's out there on every argument. There's no doubt about that. One thing we can do is be clear that where Epicurus stood on the subject is that he did believe that humans have a certain amount of agency and the ability to influence their future, and he considered that to be an important part of his philosophy. And whether in the end we are satisfied with every in and out of detail that he came up with, in the end we know what his conclusion was and that he did think it was important. Now, having said that, there are many aspects of it that DeWitt has covered in separate sections here. And as we continue through the podcast after this opening discussion, we'll just go back into his sequence and try to make sure that we hit the major points that he is bringing up for us. That continues to be, in my mind, one of the real benefits of DeWitt's book, is that even where you disagree with some of his details, he does provide a sweeping overview of the entire subject, so that if you follow his organization and follow the way he's laid everything out, you're going to get a much wider and broader overview of the philosophy than if you would just focused on ethics or physics or epistemology separately. So having said that, we had a good discussion last week with all sorts of subjects that came up, and we've done all sorts of reading since then. And before we just go back into continuing on page 175 in the section on freedom and necessity, I thought I'd throw it open to see if anybody had come up with anything from last week they wanted to talk about further.
Yes. So if you look on page 175, the last paragraph, the first half of the paragraph is all fine. And then really DeWitt uses formulations which I think are outright wrong. So in an infinite universe dominated by these physical laws, man is miraculously exempt. Already using the word miraculously is wrong. Okay, the next sentence is okay. But then the laws of nature are in the main restrict to the world of inorganic things. So try to make the volition that you hop off the cliff and fly. You will hit the ground very hard and fatally. So that means the laws of nature do apply to us organic beings.
Martin, my response to that would be that you're reading it exactly as written. I would say DeWitt is being in his poetic mode. Anybody reading Epicurus knows that there are no miracles in Epicurus. And so miraculously, like you say, is the wrong word, as well as exempt. You are taking a literal reading of the word exempt, and we certainly are not exempt in full from all of the laws of nature. If you do attempt to jump off the wall of the canyon, you are going to fall. What I would say DeWitt was attempting to do there poetically is he's saying that we are not exempt, but we are able in certain instances to add our own influence to the result. We can choose to decide whether to walk to the left or the right, or choose to decide whether to jump off the cliff or not. And so the basic point of all we're discussing here is that we are not totally bound by the laws of determinism, but certainly on the other hand, we are not fully exempt from them either. What's the way that Epicurus expressed it? Some things happen by necessity, some things happen by accident, and some things are our own choice. I would just give that in follow up to what you're saying, because you're right. We're not exempt, and the laws of nature do apply to us. One of the laws of nature seems to be, though, that we have some free will.
And that does seem to be the point. I was reading a paper by Jeffrey Puritan, and the title is Epicurus on Free Volition and the Atomic Swerve. And it seems like his point was that Epicurus was a materialist. There was no supernatural mechanism. The gods were not controlling our fates, all that kind of stuff. And his position was, as I remember it, that Epicurus would have looked to the swerve. He was making an analogy between the things that we see at the macroscopic level and the things that happen at the atomic level, and things about, we fall down because of our weight. The atoms fall because of their weight. And we obviously have free volition, and there has to be some sort of atomic analogy to that. And so he's saying that Epicurus came up with the swerve to sort of give the quote unquote randomness of our actions, because sometimes we're not sure what we're going to do, and then we end up making a decision. And he was trying to say that somehow the swerve, which he posits that it's not an uncommon occurrence, that it's like happening all the time. And that's sort of the analogy where there's still an atomic cause for our actions, but it's not something that you can predict. We're not bound to any particular one path. That seems to be his position. So I found that kind of interesting just from a purely materialistic viewpoint. But I was also reading into the book I just mentioned before we started today, the 800 and some pages of the Oxford Handbook of Epicurus and Epicureanism. And there's a chapter in there on voluntary action and responsibility, which has a bunch of sections on nature, book 25, which is evidently the book where Epicurus was talking about the whole idea of moral responsibility and everything. And I know we've talked a little bit about the idea of downward causation and emergent properties and things like that. And oddly enough, the sections that I was able to read before we went online today about from book 25 is that it seems like Epicurus wanted to posit the idea that our original atoms that come together to form our mind are sort of the original foundation that we have to work with, but we can change what we pay attention to. We can change our ideas and beliefs as we develop. And so there's this idea of like a foundational structure to our mind, but then there's also, as we develop and get new information, we decide what we're going to pay attention to. And so they draw the analogy, and Epicurus himself seems to draw the analogy for a mundane example. If you see a piece of cake and you have trained your mind to, if you're on a diet or whatever, if you have trained your mind to think about a course of action where you don't eat the cake, then that's one direction you can take. But if you have not trained your mind and decided you're going to stick to your diet, that you're going to just like eat the cake right away and not even think about it. So it's that idea of like the development of your responsibility gets to a point then where you are actually responsible for your actions, even though there is, a basic underlying structure to your atoms anyway, but you have the ability to make those changes. That's a little rambling, I realize, but I'll throw that out there for some discussion.
Yeah, now there's one more point to be made here on this question of whether the laws of nature are in the main restricted to the world of inorganic things, as DeWitt says at the bottom. Lucretius, on this question of determinism, uses the example of the racehorse. You may be thinking of the Circus Maximus in Rome, where they race chariots, although I don't know if that was built in his time. But the argument goes that when you see racehorses and the starting gate opens and the whip cracks, there's a brief moment between when those things happen and between when the horse moves forward. And that's the moment where nothing seems to be going on, is the moment where the will or the volition of the horse takes over. In other words, it's not the crack of the whip. It's not the physical striking of the whip against the horse's body that pushes the horse forward. It's the volition of the horse to engage its own muscles and to push forward of its own free will.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Let me add another caveat for just a second. I know that, speaking for myself, I have not been preparing for the last 4 weeks or 4 years all of my thoughts on determinism, summarizing them here in this episode. So I reserve for myself the ability to revise and extend and correct or totally change my comments even as the episode goes forward. It seems like when I read an article, I come up with an impression every time. So I think that's another caveat I would presume unless Don or Joshua or Calasini or Martin would like to say differently, I presume we're all still in the process of studying and thinking about these issues. And so people listening to the episode should not presume that any particular statement is the final word.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the best way. It's not the
Yeah,
final word.
that's a good way to put it. And I think the fact that there is such an abundance of opinion, even in academia and the various Epicurean philosopher scholarship people out there, that we certainly don't have to come up with any sort of fundamental truth in this particular episode. And I would put a plug in for the forum. This will be a good topic for the forum, that I think we should probably start a thread on this determinism and the swerve and everything on the forum, and let people provide their thoughts there as well. So that's one of the great uses of the EpicureanFriends.com forum.
Okay, why don't we go back into where DeWitt is and just use that as to prompt us as we go forward. I will say, in response to what Don said earlier, we do already in our threads for episodes 168 and this one, 169. Don especially has found some really good articles already, one from Scientific American that I thought was particularly good about, does quantum mechanics rule out free will? But there's a huge amount of articles out there on this topic, and we'll put the ones that come to our attention as of greatest use on the threads.
Yeah, and I will say I do take some comfort in the various opinions that are out there. I'm like, so nobody has this really figured out yet, so it doesn't make me feel too bad.
I have a brief detour here. This is going to take a minute. So, in the age of exploration, this Italian cartographer and explorer named Amerigo Vespucci traveled to the New World and made a map with the name Amerigo on it. That's how we get the name America. In his journal of his adventures, he records that he encountered Native Americans, and he says that their mode of life is what I would describe as Epicurean. And of course, Thomas More back in England reads this travelogue and decides to use this as a conceit for a book, which he calls Utopia, that somewhere in the New World, there's this kingdom or realm of perfect happiness, which he calls Utopia, which means no place. Nowhere is this ever going to happen in his view. But one of the things he articulates in his Utopia is a level of religious freedom which they don't have in Europe or in England of More's time, and which he thinks in many ways it wouldn't really work in practice. But in Utopia, it says this. He says, he, Utopus, the king of Utopia, therefore left men wholly to their liberty, that they might be free to believe as they should see cause. Only he made a solemn and severe law against such as should so far degenerate from the dignity of human nature as to think that their souls died with their bodies, or that the world was the mere sport of chance, without a wise overruling providence. For they all formerly believed that there was a state of rewards and punishments to the good and bad after this life. And they now look on those that think otherwise as scarce fit to be counted men, since they degrade so noble a being as the soul, and reckon it no better than a beast's. Thus they are far from looking on such men as fit for human society, or to be citizens of a well-ordered commonwealth, since a man of such principles must needs, as often as he dares do it, despise all the laws and customs. For there is no doubt to be made that a man who is afraid of nothing but the law and apprehends nothing after death will not scruple to break through all the laws of his country, either by fraud or force, when by this means he may satisfy his appetites. I probably went a little longer there than I could have. But this idea that the universe is the mere sport of chance and that the souls die with the body is more sort of criticizing what he thinks of as being Epicurean positions, I think. And what we're going to talk about today is whether that's actually what Epicurus thought, that the universe was the mere sport of chance. And that's this heading here, necessity and fortune. And one thing I see today, particularly among people who put forward creationism or intelligent design, they'll say things like, the odds of the human being just coming together out of natural chance is like a tornado going through a junkyard and creating a Boeing 757. It's that ridiculous. But as we have been talking about here a little bit, it's not wholly governed by chance, the universe. It's governed by laws. And those laws, like the laws in biology, laws like natural selection, which by virtue of being selection is not chance, is how things really come about. So it'll be interesting to find out how far chance controls things in the Epicurean perspective. And just by looking at this first paragraph and the Roman and Greek deity associated with chance, which in Rome was Fortuna, And the Epicureans seem to have little time for this. So I'll be curious to see how this turns out, because it would give us some information about where Thomas More might have gone wrong.
I do find it interesting. I think that is a great thing to bring up, Joshua, because that is one of the things that you often hear arguments against, atheism or agnosticism or something. It's like, well, there are no morals without God. There are no morals without the Bible. It's like, it's everybody believed in no life after death or that sort of thing. There'd be no morals and that sort of. So that's certainly understandable, that viewpoint, because it's still current today. But it does bear repeating that evidently Epicurus didn't totally dismiss chance as a force in our lives, but it wasn't the only one. So I think it's important to keep that sort of perspective in mind, that there are things that happen by necessity, things that happen by chance, and then things that are up to us. So there's that threefold thing, and that chance and necessity, I think, are the ones where we are subject to the laws of nature, and in addition to inorganic things.
Right, and that getting rid of determinism and just putting chance in its place doesn't, in Epicurus's view, really solve the problem.
Right.
And the problem being how to deal with chance when it does impact us in undesirable ways. For example, at the beginning of the third paragraph, he's used the example that we as individuals have no control over whether our city is attacked by an approaching army or not. There's certain things like that that are just out of our control. And so DeWitt is talking here in terms of necessity and fortune, that for all such exigencies, according to Epicurus, the wise man will keep himself prepared through addiction to the simple life and the cultivation of self-sufficiency. And he says, the wise man, when confronted by lack of necessities, stands by to share with others rather than have them share with him. So great a reserve of self-sufficiency he discovers. So maybe to some extent in this section, DeWitt is talking about the issue of what do you do in response to the fact that some things are out of our control. And it seems to be a theme that Epicurus isn't going to simply stand by and say, okay, some things are in our control, some things are not. He's going to say, well, what do we do about this analysis? Those things that are out of our control, do we just simply stand by and do nothing? Or do we attempt to minimize the possibility of particular accidents or particular events coming our way and causing us trouble? For example, there's no way to deal with the fact that we're all going to die, but we can prepare ourselves for it. And then when death comes into our lives, deal with it in a more successful way without quite as much harm and long-lasting damage as it would otherwise cause to us. His example here about the simple life and cultivation of self-sufficiency is one of those ethical, practical conclusions that seems to flow from his observations about the way nature is set up. You're not going to just do nothing and just take every blow as it comes. To the extent you can, you should prepare yourself to take the blows of things that are outside of your control, which you can do by accustoming yourself to a simple lifestyle, not indulging in luxuries that can easily be taken away from you, that can easily be lost, and to cultivate self-sufficiency. People will sometimes talk about self-sufficiency almost as if they're encouraging you to be aloof and detached, and that you should simply not care whether your wife and children and everything that belongs to you are suddenly taken away from you at the whim of God, such as Job in the book of Job has to go through. You should, to the extent that you can, cultivate self-sufficiency in a way that makes you mentally understanding that these things are possibly going to be taken from you at some point by accident, but that if you organize your life properly, you can minimize that possibility from happening.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought both of those up. I think the simple living there is one of those things where people will take to be, it's like, oh, I should live like an ascetic and I should not have anything and I should, to use your phrase, live in a cave, and that kind of simple living. So I think it's always important to drive the point home that it's not simple living in that sense. It's to be satisfied with what you have and then to take the extravagances as they come or as they become available to you and to enjoy them and all that sort of thing. And the self-sufficiency, I remember we had a discussion on the forum, maybe a year ago now, about the different connotations of that word in Greek, that it actually is, it's both from a financial standpoint that you should be self-sufficient as much as you can, and also to have a more internal self-sufficient in yourself, that you have control over your demeanor and that sort of thing.
Yeah, Don, to try to drive home the point and say it better than I said it the first time, the point is not to be living simply for the sake of living simply.
Right.
There's a method behind his apparent madness or his use of this kind of a technique. You're attempting to organize your life so as to live as pleasurably as you can, knowing that some things are out of your control. You don't have the ability to assure yourself that you're going to have a banquet in front of you every time you sit down to a meal, and things can and do happen to you that you should be prepared for. And being self-sufficient in general is going to certainly smooth out some of the worst pains that can come your way when bad things happen, while still allowing you to enjoy those pleasures that are available to you.
Exactly. Yep. Good point. Yep. Well put.
You know, it's in this section that DeWitt includes one of the sayings that we just need to be sure we've covered when we're talking about determinism in general. On page 177, he talks about, I think it's one of the Vatican sayings, I'm forgetting which one it is, but it's, quote, "The man who declares that everything happens of necessity can have no fault to find with the man who denies that anything happens of necessity. For he is saying that this very denial is made of necessity."
Vatican saying 40, I just pulled it up, yep.
So you've got it in the Vatican sayings, you've got it in the letter to Menorchius, you've got it in Lucretius, you've got it all over Epicurean text. This issue is of practical importance to people. As Calasini mentioned last week, people who get too far into the rabbit hole of determinism can end up demoralizing themselves into a sort of passivity that can be very damaging to their happiness. This is sort of an echo of what's argued in the Sedley article that we mentioned last week as well. The sort of self-refutation argument that Epicurus is employing here, the man who argues that necessity is controlling everything, is really being illogical by even arguing the point, because why are you even trying to change something if everything happens of necessity? This is an argument that points out the illogic of the foundation of the person who's arguing for total necessity. But it doesn't give you a technical explanation of whether necessity exists or not. DeWitt even refers to it here. Dialectic is a game, and it has to be kept in that perspective. It doesn't give you the details of the mechanisms that you'd really like to have in the way we normally think of things from a modern scientific perspective.
I was going to say, just before we get off this issue of the simple life and related issues, there's a story about Diogenes the Cynic, and of course he was like the prophet in the ancient world of absolute simplicity to a maximal extreme. He was supposedly bathing one day in the public baths, and some of the people he was arguing with took his clothes. This seems to be the oldest prank in human history, stealing people's clothes while they're bathing, and they replaced them with the finest clothes which money could buy. And when he got out of the bath and saw this, he refused to wear them. He demanded his old tattered robe back. And obviously the point of the story is, if you make a religion out of simplicity to the point where you won't even wear fine clothes if they're available to you at no charge and for no expense or problem, you don't have to go through anything to get them, they're just there, then you've completely missed the point. And I think Epicurus would be more than happy to take the fine robes if they were there and available to him. It's not like he's making a fetish out of wearing terrible clothes, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it becomes a sort of virtue signaling.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And whenever you mention the word virtue, it always goes back to that question of what is it you're trying to accomplish? What's the benefit of virtue? Is virtue its own reward? If there's a phrase I remember from elementary school, it seems like that one has stuck with me over the years. That seems to be such a recurring question, that in fact looking for a reward is demeaning and actually causes you trouble, that you should not look for a reward. You should simply be content with virtue and being good, as if that's an explanation or a goal of itself.
Oh, yeah, there's another rabbit hole with the virtue.
Oh, yeah.
Where do they come from? Where do they, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Okay, there, Don, you've given me a link to the next section. In scanning over this next section, freedom and fortune, it appears to me now that I glance at it, where does it come from, you said? This seems to be pointing out that, we talk about fortune as if it's a synonym for the word chance. But as DeWitt's pointing out here too, among the Greeks and the Romans, fortune was a deified abstraction that was very popular. Luck Be a Lady, that's the song by Frank Sinatra, I guess, but there are many other cultural references to fortune as if there is some force of fortune out there. almost as godlike, as DeWitt says, deified abstraction. That seems to be something that was of significant interest to Epicurus, that we should not consider that there's a force of fortune that's going to cause us trouble or not cause us trouble. It might be easy to just merge that into just some kind of a religious perspective. I wouldn't have any luck at all if I didn't have bad luck. There's all sorts of cliches about luck and how to get lucky. Oh, I remember a phrase. I'd rather be lucky than smart, as if there is some force that endues you with beneficial results in your life, as opposed to the dark cloud that hangs over some people. Luck and fortune are forces, which of course is something that Epicurus is rejecting. But in this section here, we're probably getting some examples that might be worth talking about.
And it just literally hit me now. So the headings in the paragraphs are necessity and fortune, and then freedom and fortune. So we have two. So we looked at the necessary ones, and now we're moving on to what it means to be free and have fortune.
Yes, meaning that certain things are made necessary by the universe, as if there's some force that makes it necessary. And then now certain things are caused by the universe to be random, as if there's a force of necessity and a force of randomness. And this force perspective seems to be a problem.
And Cassius, I would argue that even emphasizing this idea of a force of randomness is going too far. If you believe that everything in nature happens at the roll of a dice, it completely removes any ability that humans could or would have to predict what happens in nature. And he uses a little bit above where we're reading now, he uses the example of the hurricane. There's two potholes you can fall into here. If you think that a hurricane happens because of necessity or fate or because of the will of the gods, then you're going to immediately fall on your knees and start praying because you think you've done something horribly wrong. But if you think that it happens because of blind chance, then you're never going to look for the underlying causes. And you're never going to ask yourself, well, maybe I shouldn't have built my house here. Maybe if I go just a little bit more inland or uphill, I wouldn't be underwater right now. So it's the idea that the universe has some aspects of it that are not fated, but that are predictable and that we can rely on to produce certain results consistently is another reason why we try to avoid the pitfall of fortune or blind chance, because not everything works that way.
And in contrasting those two things there, Joshua, I see in the last sentence of DeWitt's first paragraph here, he's saying that the attitude recommended towards fortune by Epicurus was defiance. And we'll go further in talking about what he means by that. I don't see an equivalent sentence at the beginning of his discussion of necessity, but I don't think that Epicurus would recommend defiance to necessity. If it truly is necessity, like death, for example, you don't necessarily defy death. You postpone it to the extent that you can. You understand it to make sure that you don't let it get you down too much, but you don't necessarily defy death. But in terms of an allegation that there's a fortune out there, a force that is rolling the dice for you, you would actually defy that attitude because that's just simply not the case. There's no goddess of fortune deciding whether there's going to be a war next week or not. And I happen to have the page open to the thread from last week, and I see one of the YouTube videos that Don posted is titled, "Does Free Will Violate the Laws of Physics?" And it's entitled Free Will. But the background picture is a bunch of dice. And dice is probably an interesting symbol to think about when we're discussing this issue, because even when we talk about whether everything is necessary or not, we're not postulating that there is a goddess of fortune throwing dice. We're not in a casino where the table is being set. There's not dice being thrown on the table constantly. You're not pulling the arms of the one-armed bandit and having allegedly random results calculated for you.
So Principle Doctrine 16. Now I have the St. Andre translation, which says, chance steals only a bit into the life of a wise person. For throughout the complete span of his life, the greatest and most important matters have been, are, and will be directed by the power of reason. So this seems like an appropriate principle doctrine to bring in, since you were saying something about the rolling of dice. So which is, we always think of that as the idea of chance.
Of course, it's one of the most important doctrines. It probably should have been the one we highlighted as much as anything else, because this, again, is where the practical result comes in, that even if you acknowledge that there are certain things in life that are pure chance, This is what DeWitt is saying. You're not going to just accept it and blindly go walking down the road as if paying no attention to this fact. If there's a possibility of some kind of an accidental intrusion into your life, you are going to take steps through reason to attempt to make sure that doesn't happen to you. We don't have the Greek text, I guess, to know what word is used for chance there, but that probably really is one of the big take-home positions of Epicurus on this entire topic, is that you have the power to use your reason to minimize the possibility of accidental bad things happening to you. My gosh, if there's any firm takeaway from the whole discussion, it's that everything does not happen to you by necessity. It's not necessary that some tornado bear down on you and kill you in every instance. You have the ability to get into the basement or to avoid the tornado in many instances just through location. As Joshua's example a few minutes ago, if you don't want to get hit by a hurricane and have your house blown away, you always have the possibility of building your house inland or on a mountain or someplace where the hurricane can't take your house away. You have the ability to change what happens to you in your future. And you're going to do it, as Epicurus says, through your ability to use your reason. As you said, that was number 16. That's certainly in the top half of the principal doctrines.
And it is tuke that is the word for chance that's used there.
Which tells you what? Is that a religious reference or
Well, that is the name of the goddess of fortune, but it's also the word that would have been used just for chance or fortune or that sort of idea. So it's a taiki, tuke, depending on how you want to pronounce it.
Yes, and Calasini, in addition to the one you mentioned, there is the Vatican saying from Metrodorus, where he says, quote, "Fortune, I have forestalled thee and barricaded thine every entrance, and neither to thee nor to any other surprise of life will we give ourselves in surrender." A very strongly worded statement of the same thing, I think, as the doctrine that you just read, Calasini, that you are going to take action to the extent that you can to minimize the harm that can be done to you by accidental injuries.
And Benjamin Franklin, with a touch of irony, says this. He says, "It has pleased God in his goodness to mankind at length to discover to them the means of securing their habitations and other buildings from mischief by thunder and lightning. The method is this." He's describing his invention of the lightning rod. And in a touch of irony, as I said, says it pleases God finally, after all these millennia, we're finally going to figure this problem out. But of course, it's Benjamin Franklin figuring this problem out. How to forestall the apparently random strikes of lightning that burn down this building, but not the building next to it. We can solve this problem. We have the ability because we can predict how it works and how we might forestall it. We can forestall the devastation that is wrought to our structures and other things that we own just by putting up lightning rods.
Yeah, there's also, I'm not sure whether, did we bring up the section in the letter to Menoikeus where he talks about facing the vicissitudes of fortune?
I don't think we did, Don. Let's talk about that because you know it better than I do. Is this the part where the future is not entirely within your control and not entirely outside of your control? Or there
is that one, but there's also in section 131, I will be completely tooting my own horn, and I'll read my translation that I had. So in section 131, it says, "A simple meal of hearty, wholesome bread and spring water delivers the most extreme pleasure whenever food and drink have been brought to bear against hunger and thirst. And when extravagant experiences do come up every once in a while, they are experienced more intensely by us, and we are better able to fearlessly face the vicissitudes of fortune." So that sort of gives you an idea. That goes back to that whole simple living excerpt that DeWitt was talking about.
You know, when you add that passage together with the long passage on determinism to the passage that I just mentioned about your future's not entirely in or outside of your control, you could almost assemble an argument that this issue of free will and taking charge of your life is one of the central themes of the letter. Certainly happiness is possibly the number one theme of the letter, and he mentions the issues of God and death and so forth, but maybe the unifying practical result of everything he's saying is to take this information and take charge of your life to do the best you can to work towards that happy result that is the goal.
Exactly. And the section you were talking about the things happen by chance is that even though some things happen by necessity, some things by chance, and some by our own powers, for although necessity is beyond our control, they see that chance is unstable and there is no other master beyond themselves, so that praise and its opposite are inseparably connected to themselves.
And it continues on at the part about it'd be better to believe in the. Go
exactly.
Ahead
Yeah, because of this, it is better to follow the stories of the gods than to be enslaved by the deterministic decrees of the old natural philosophers, because necessity is not moved by prayer, and such a one accepts that fortune is not a god, as the hoi polloi understand, for a god does nothing in a disorderly or haphazardly manner. And it is not the uncertain cause of everything, for one cannot think it can grant good or evil for a person's blessed life. However, it does furnish for oneself the starting point of great goods and great evils, believing that it is better to be unfortunate rationally than fortunate irrationally, because it is better to have been deciding the noble way and accomplishing one's actions, and to have been foiled than having decided the bad way and to succeed by means of chance. My take on that is that he's saying that it's better to plan for things and to not have them work out than to just blithely go throughout your life and just say, no, what, que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. So,
right.
There was a wealthy merchant in pre-revolutionary America, or in the American colonies, named Lord Timothy Dexter. And he was renowned as a kind of buffoon, but he wrote an autobiography in which he describes how he made his wealth, basically. And it's stupid stuff. Like he took a bunch of gloves and warm coats to the Caribbean and tried to sell them. And you think, well, what kind of moron would take winter clothes to the Caribbean to make money? Well, of course, there happens to be a Russian trading vessel that comes through, and they're heading to Siberia, and there's nothing on earth they need more than warm clothes. So it's silly stuff like that's how he makes his fortune over time. And he was roundly considered to have been a great fool, but a very, very rich fool. So I don't know if that explains this issue of whether fortune determines whether you succeed or not, but it is an interesting story.
Mm-hmm. That sounds not altogether different than, I'm looking at page 178 and the last full paragraph on 178, and DeWitt quotes a saying that is not familiar to me. He's got a footnote 22. He says, quote, nature teaches us to appraise as of minor value the gifts of fortune, and to recognize that when fortunate we are unfortunate, and when faring ill not to set great store by faring well, and to accept without emotion the blessings of fortune, and to remain on guard against the seeming evils from her hand. For everything that to the multitude seems good or bad is but ephemeral, and under no circumstances does wisdom enter into partnership with fortune. That's Usner 489.
I have 489. I'm using the Atlas site.
Mm-hmm.
And so Usner 489 comes from Porphyry and from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. From the letter to Marcella by Porphyry, the one that's quoted here says, it's a couple lines long here. So, nature also teaches us to regard the outcomes of fortune of little account, and to know how to face misfortune when we are favored by fortune, but not to consider the favors of fortune important when we experience misfortune. And nature teaches us to accept unperturbed the good outcomes of fortune, while standing prepared in the face of the seeming evils which come from fate. For all that the masses regard as good is a fleeting fancy, but wisdom and knowledge have nothing in common with fortune. It doesn't say Epicurus said or whatever, but I'm assuming it's ascribed to Epicurus.
That whole letter to Porphyry seems to be considered to be Epicurean in nature.
Yeah, and then the Cicero quote is, shall we allow this man to be forgetful of himself and be disdainful of fortune at the moment when all that he holds good and evil is at fortune's disposal? And that's from Tusculan Disputations 2:3.8.
Has anyone heard the story about the Chinese farmer who lost his horse? Because I'm about to tell that.
Oh yeah,
Go ahead.
No, that's a good one. No, that's right on point.
Yeah. So there was this farmer, and the story comes from China. And one day his horse ran away, and his neighbor came over and said, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I'm terribly sorry that happened. You know, this would have been a huge source of his wealth." And the farmer said, "We shall see." And the next day, the horse comes back, and he brings a whole herd of wild horses with it. Immediately, the farmer becomes wealthy overnight. And his neighbor comes over and congratulates him. And the farmer says, "We shall see." And then the next day, while the farmer's son is out trying to break one of the wild horses, he falls and breaks his leg. And the neighbor comes over and says, "Well, I'm terribly sorry that this happened to you." And the farmer says, "We shall see." And the next day, the representative of the Emperor of China comes around pulling volunteers to go to the army. And the farmer's son, because he has broken his leg, is exempt from having to go to the front line. And the neighbor comes over and says, well, congratulations that your son doesn't have to go do this. And the farmer says, we shall see. And it just goes on and on like that, that the moods and swings of fortune are not what we should base our happiness on, because just as one day they can seem to be very good for you, tomorrow they might turn out to be very bad for you.
Yeah, so basically you take it as it comes, but don't necessarily get attached to the idea you're going to like work out all your problems through fortune. But yeah, that's a great story.
Yeah, you roll with the punches.
Roll with the punches, exactly. And try to plan to avoid the punches. But if you can't, you got to do what you got to do.
Mm-hmm.
This has certainly been a wide-ranging conversation today. So it just goes to show all the implications and everything of these particular topics that DeWitt brings up in this chapter.
And rolling with the punches, I think, is the last point that he makes in this subsection, because he goes now into the discussions of the person who is tortured alive inside the brazen bull of Phalaris. And DeWitt's point is that Cicero and even Seneca ridicule Epicurus for saying that the wise man is happy even while he's being inside the brazen bull, even in bad circumstances. Somebody correct me if they get a different point of what DeWitt is saying here, because he kind of defers this point until later on. But I think the point he's talking about in this context is that Epicurus is saying you need to be in control of your experience and not put too much emphasis on the benefits of good fortune or the detriments of bad fortune. And even if you have the extreme bad fortune of being inside the bull of Phalaris, being tortured, being in some terrible circumstance, whether you come through the circumstance or not, as a human being, as someone who has the ability to think about his overall circumstances, at least when you think about the sum of your life, even if you're tortured at the last moments of your life, you can think about the fact that although this is very bad fortune, you've had a lot of good fortune in the past, you've had a lot of good things happen to you, and you can look at things from a higher perspective than just the pain of the moment. If anybody have a different take?
I think this is one of the more controversial passages in any aspect of Epicurean philosophy. It's like it's this one, and it's the claim that pain is short if intense. Those are the two that most people seem to have a problem with. And William Shakespeare, in his play Richard II, expresses it this way. He says, "Who can hold a fire in his hand by thinking on the frosty Caucasus, or cloy the hungry edge of appetite by bare imagination of a feast, or wallow naked in December snow by thinking on fantastic summer's heat? Oh no, the apprehension of the good gives but the greater feeling to the worse. Fell sorrow's tooth doth never rankle more than when he bites, but lanceth not the sore." The idea that thinking about things you don't have, or thinking about, if you're experiencing one kind of pain, thinking about what would soothe that pain actually makes the pain worse, is the claim here.
Although research does show that if you swear whenever you have pain, that you feel less of the pain. So you can take it longer. So
I've been administering that medicine for a very long time.
I should read more of what DeWitt says in that last paragraph, because he does explain, maybe his ultimate point is that Cicero and Seneca are quibbling over words because, quote, Cicero chose to ignore the difference between pleasant and happy. The martyr at the stake may still claim to be a happy man, but he cannot claim to be experiencing pleasure. The point is a good one, I think, that there's a difference between pleasant and happy, that the words that you're talking about are significantly different in meaning. You are not experiencing pleasure when you're being tortured. The exact quote that DeWitt uses here is, quote, "Even if put to torture, the wise man is happy," unquote. The wise man is not experiencing pleasure when he's put to torture, but the wise man can claim that he has been living a happy life.
And that's another one of my hobby horses, too. The word that's used there is eudaimonia. It's not happy. It's not happiness. It's not like, la-di-da-di-da, skipping through the roses kind of thing. It's eudaimonia again. I translated that particular one on my characteristics of the sage as the wise one will have a sense of fulfillment even on the rack, even though they will moan and wail when tortured. So it's like, you can still sense that, you've lived the right way. You have a sense of well-being. You are not going to be experiencing any sort of pleasure. That's probably the most ultimate pain inside the bull of Phalaris. But you can still say it's like, I ended up here. I lived well, that sort of thing. So it's not happy as tra-la-la-lolly. It's, that sort of eudaimonia sense. And for anyone who isn't clear about the Bull of Phalaris, my understanding is that it was a hollow bronze sculpture of a bull that had a hole in the side of it, and they would put you inside of it, lock the door, and then light a fire under the bull, and then you would slowly roast to death. So that gives you an idea of the torture that he's talking about there. And oddly enough, the word that's used in the characteristics of the sage in Diogenes, it has to do with the rack, being stretched on the rack. So that's the word that's actually used there.
Yeah, and the claim about the bull is that its mouth was made in such a way that it would convert human screams into grunts.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. Yeah. Good point. So it was actually, it looked like a real bull snorting and everything, like even though there was somebody being roasted alive inside of it.
Yeah, it's horrible. In fact, the other story about the bull is that the person who made it and presented it to the king was put inside of it as an example because it was such a horrible thing.
Oh, wow. Boy, the ingenuity of humanity right there, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Wow.
There is a story. I don't want to dwell too long on issues like martyrdom and all that, because I don't think it's really possible to know what you would do if you were put to torture. And it's not a reflection of who you are if you fail that test, because it's beyond the pale of anything that any human being should ever have to experience.
Agreed.
But Giordano Bruno, who was not an Epicurean, but took a lot of Lucretius's ideas about nature to their logical conclusions, was imprisoned for something like 7 years by the Cardinal Bellarmino in Rome for beliefs relating to materialism and that there are other worlds besides this one, and ideas like that everything is made of atoms and void. He was imprisoned for 7 years. Unlike Galileo and the others, he refused to recant his position. And when he was finally led to the stake in the Campo dei Fiori in Rome, he was given one final chance to recant. Even at that point, refused to do it. And the last thing they did before they burned him alive was drove 2 nails through his lips in the shape of a cross, just to shut him up. But to the very end, he was still, in essence, accusing his accusers, not unlike Socrates in that way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A century or two afterwards, a group of merchants and educated people built or commissioned a statue which now faces the Vatican. He's sort of glowering under his hood and in the direction of the Vatican. So,
well, there's another site to visit on the bucket list.
Yeah. Well, let's visit the next section, Freedom and the Gods. And here DeWitt is talking about the issue. We touched on it earlier, I think, about whether the gods themselves are subject to fate. And DeWitt is talking about here that the Greek view of the gods was so different from our current omnipotent, omniscient type of a perspective that you have to be careful about what you would think, how they relate to the issues of freedom. Epicurus was at no less pains to assert the freedom of the gods than the freedom of man. And it was his thinking that it was no less necessary for the gods to be free from servitude to man than for man to be free from servitude to the gods. I think that's a reference to the argument he makes several times that the gods are not going to be enslaving themselves to micromanaging every minute thing that happens in existence from moment to moment. The gods don't spend their time numbering the feathers on the birds and counting the hairs on your head to make sure that they're exactly where they're supposed to be.
Exactly. Yeah, I would agree. And that seems like such a simple assertion, too, that if the gods are micromanaging the universe, that does not lead to happiness, eudaimonia, well-being, satisfaction, any of those kinds of words.
Which appear to be things that he applies to the gods. He doesn't jump to some kind of an abstract, different type of existence. It's almost as if the activities of the gods are understandable to men in terms of their being happy and experiencing pleasures.
Yeah, and then I see down a little bit farther, and he talks about all the slights against the gods and everything, just to show that the idea of the Greek gods is not in keeping with an Epicurean perspective.
And of course, Lucretius takes that to its most barbaric conclusion by suggesting that humans are at their worst when they try to appease the gods, as in the case of Agamemnon and his daughter.
Tantum religio potuit suadere malorum.
Maybe I'm reading enough of this section to piece together another theme. When he's talking about Menander and then going over and referring to Plato, there's a section here discussing providence. And maybe the theme here is, DeWitt is pointing out that the Epicurean gods, or the idea of a single God that we have today of, quote, God is love, meaning that God is some force in the universe of omnipotent love, and he's got everything working together for good for those who love them and so forth. I think DeWitt's pointing out here that that was just not the Greek attitude. And although that kind of viewpoint would be totally inconsistent with what Epicurus taught, it's not even something that he necessarily would have addressed because they just didn't see things that way. He's talking about Plato and the ordering of the universe that Plato had suggested, or that Aristotle suggests, and so forth, as being something, of course, that Epicurus rejected.
I see what you're saying,
Also,
Cassius, that the gods of the Greeks were very different from, well, I shouldn't say very different. They were different in some ways from maybe current conceptions of religion. And what you'll see in commentators on Lucretius and Epicurus is that if only they had lived a century longer, in the case of Lucretius, they would have learned the truth about the true religion. I don't think that's true. I think that Lucretius, as we see certainly in the case of Lucian of Samosata, would have been just as critical about the claims that are made today about religion as they were about the claims that were made by the priests and prophets and oracles of the ancient Greek religion.
Yeah, I fully agree with that.
And in all cases in this chapter, the main focus is that true human freedom, the freedom that's promised by philosophy, is freedom from fate, freedom from determinism, freedom from pure chance, and freedom from providence.
Yeah, it always comes back to that whole idea of the personal responsibility that Epicurus seems to hit on, for me at least. Some things do happen by chance. Some things, are necessary just through the laws of the universe, laws of physical existence. And then some things are, in his words, up to us.
I see DeWitt is saying that, quote, even the goodness of Plato's supreme God, the demiurge, by no means consisted in benevolence towards mankind. And he also says that it's difficult for Plato to come to grips with the problem of freedom in a practical way. This is an interesting comment, a difficulty inherent in theocentric structures of thought. So I think that's something we've touched on already. The difficulties that supernatural religion has in dealing with the reality that if we see all these terrible things happening around us, how do you explain these things? Is that something that's a part of this supposedly perfect supernatural being that created the universe? Or is it something that has been injected into the result due to some kind of freedom? And so freedom, it poses a particular problem to theocentric structures of the thought. We don't talk about it very much. I think we've basically decided that the riddle of Epicurus is probably not necessarily straight from Epicurus in the first place. But you see a lot of discussion about that on the internet that I think comes through Lactantius and perhaps David Hume. And that points out some of these issues as well, that it's very difficult to reconcile a omnipotent, purely good being with all of the very ungood things that we see around us.
Yeah, and it also takes away human freedom, as he says here. There's that, I guess you see a number of images. Everyone's seen that picture or drawing or painting or whatever it is of the surgeon at the operating table working on the patient, but Jesus is standing behind him and holding his hand and guiding the scalpel. Or the president in the Oval Office and Jesus is standing behind the president as he signs a bill into law. Well, if Jesus is holding your hand, making you do all this stuff, are you really doing any of it? That's the question. Do you even have the freedom to make a decision here if the decision is being made by the person standing behind you holding your hand? And in the case of the surgeon, if the surgery goes wrong, whose fault is it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So all of these things are, people do these things because they want to feel like someone is in control of their lives. Someone cares about them and is working all things toward a good goal or a good end. But Epicurus, I think, thinks in reality, it's just not like that. It doesn't matter if, that you want to go to heaven for all eternity. It's just not in the cards. It's not going to happen. And that to actually have someone standing over your shoulder directing every move wouldn't be good. It would be a bad thing because it would totally remove any power you have as an individual to make choices and to live with the consequences, which is part of freedom. There's a particularly horrifying passage in Tertullian when he says, you philosophers, you scoffers, you laugh now, but when judgment day comes and I'm waiting to go into the pearly gates of heaven, I'll be looking down at you as you're hurled into hell, and I'll be the one laughing that day. That's going to be one of the keenest pleasures of paradise, is laughing at the people who are burning in hell, who laughed at us while we were alive.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's a pleasant little sentiment there. You bringing that up reminds me of the passage in Lucretius about him standing on the hillside, seeing the shipwreck and the battles, and feeling. I hesitate to use the word fortunate, but feeling fortunate that it's not happening to him. And those two passages sort of illustrate to me. It's like I get the impression, and I know we've talked about it before in the podcast, that Lucretius he's not necessarily taking pleasure in the suffering of others, but he's taking pleasure in the fact that it's thank heavens it's not happening to me. Whereas the other guy is like, party time, look at all you sinners, woohoo.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a definite contrast between those two passages. I'm glad you brought that up, Don. That's a very interesting comparison. Because as I've said before, Lucretius wants everyone to be
exactly.
He doesn't want anybody to be in that shipwreck. That's his ideal,
Exactly.
But crowing over the misery of the people who are in hell is part and parcel of Tertullian's understanding of heaven. And
Exactly.
Tertullian is, one of the church fathers, so it's not like anyone's gone to great lengths to repudiate what he had to say from inside the church.
Right, exactly. And same way with the Bishop of Alexandria being made a father of the church or that sort of thing that was responsible for Hypatia's death. So
yeah, and as late as recent French history, I say recent, this is several centuries ago, but
well, when you're talking about ancient Greece, it is recent, so that's okay.
Yeah, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where the Huguenots in France were basically all massacred all across the countryside in one particularly horrific month. And the response by the Pope was to strike a medal in honor of the king for doing this. So,
tantum religio, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes. Okay, well, we've ended up spending today's episode probably much better than we might have by going in circles on some of the details of the arguments about necessity that modern philosophers spend a lot of their time on. But unfortunately, we have the necessity of bringing the show to a close today. We can either close it on where we are or go into the necessity of death very briefly. I think that what I would do here is just make the point, because it fits with the little analogy I'm drawing. We have a necessity to end our podcast today because no way around that. We have a necessity of death that is unavoidable as well. He cites Metrodorus's Vatican saying number 31, against all other hazards it is possible for us to gain security for ourselves. But so far as death is concerned, all of us human beings inhabit a city without walls. And DeWitt draws this conclusion. The immediate effect of this is to invest the present with a pressing urgency and to demand the control of experience with respect to the past, the present, and the future. This amounts to control of our thoughts. A choice of attitude is involved. The past is to be regarded as unalterable, the future as undependable, and the present alone as within our power. To me, I've always thought one of the takeaways of Epicurean philosophy, if you know that you're going to die and you know that death is the end, you know that life is short, to me, that is as much motivation as anybody ought to need to want to spend your time as aggressively and use your time wisely, because you're not going to get it back again and it's not going to last very long.
Yeah, I think that is one of the things that I've heard people say about is that if you want to either purchase something or go somewhere or do something, think of it in terms of if you have a job, think about it in the amount of money that you would spend in the hours that you would be doing that thing. And is it worth it to do that? And I think that's kind of an interesting way to think of time as currency, because like you said, I mean, once you spend it, you can't get it back.
I recently came across a phrase I'd never heard before. Maybe you have, but I was reading a review on Amazon of a book, and the person said it was worth the candle. And I'd never heard that before, but I kind of like it. It makes it clear that if you're going to spend time doing this, and of course, reading by candlelight was the history of the human species for most of our history. But if you're going to spend the time to do it, it ought to be worth doing.
It ought to be worth the candle. Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Very good analogy. Very good analogy. Okay, well, why don't we go to closing comments and we'll bring today's episode to a close. So, Martin, any closing thoughts for today?
I have nothing to add. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Calasini, any closing thoughts today?
Oh, yes. It was a very enjoyable podcast. And Joshua, I really enjoyed all your stories and all your comments, and especially this very last one about being worth the candle. That's something I'm going to have to think about, because so much of my time I feel a little bit pulled and distracted, and in some sense I'm really not getting as much pleasure as I could if I was more aware of what was my priorities in life. So something for me to consider in the future and to contemplate, to get more clear on. So thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Don.
I agree with the candle analogy. I think it is a really interesting way to do that. So for anybody listening, hopefully this is worth their candle as well. It does give me some sort of solace to see how convoluted and of multiple opinions these whole topics are out there. So it makes me feel better that I don't have everything cleared up in my mind myself. So it is very interesting, and I'm looking forward to continuing these sorts of conversations on the forum as well.
Very good. Joshua.
I'm glad, Don, that we got the hard stuff out of the way, because next week is freedom, government, and law, and that should be a cakewalk.
Oh, so. Yeah, that's like good 5-10 minutes there. So that's it. Yeah.
Yep.
Followed by freedom and public careers and control of environment. So we're coming into sort of a practical freedom in the simple life.
Yeah, and on that last topic about freedom and public careers, I mean, we've been finding some interesting articles on the whole idea of Epicureans and politics and things like that. So that should give you some source material for that as well.
So the upshot of this whole topic of freedom, and I don't want to jump the gun here because clearly we've got a lot to talk about yet on this point. But the whole point seems to be that if we don't have free will, then there's absolutely no point really in even talking about philosophy, because there's no point in figuring out what the good life is, because we're just going to do whatever we were destined to do to begin with, and that's it. So
exactly.
It couldn't be, in my view, a more important question. And I know that, Don, as you said, modern thinkers have clearly gone one way on this discussion, but that shouldn't put us off from discussing some of the other implications here.
Exactly.
Yeah, that seems to me to be where Epicurus starts and ends the topic. He realizes with all of his physics and epistemology and everything else he's thought about that life is short, but that being happy is the best way to spend your time. And maybe there's a few people who think the best way to spend their time is to debate determinism endlessly and to go back and forth and never reach any conclusion about it. But for Epicurus, as a practical person, if you want to be happy and you don't find your happiness in debating determinism, then you should spend your time on those things that do make you happy and take control of your experience to the extent that you can to pursue happiness. So, okay, let's leave it at that for this week. Thanks, everybody. Please join us at the forum and make comments on this podcast and any other topics you'd like to talk about. So thank you again for your time, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.